All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Travis True. I'm programming manager for the Philadelphia Film Festival. And I am here with Ebs Burnough, who is the director of the Capote Tapes, which hopefully everyone's had a chance to watch. So, Ebs, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So the film is so fascinating and I think sheds new light on a figure who I think a lot of people probably feel like they already know somewhat, because he's certainly very visible. But could you talk a little bit about the genesis of the project, and in particular, how did you come into possession of these mysterious tapes that George Plimpton had made?
The genesis of the project was that I had been on vacation actually, and I had read a book by a friend Sally Bedell Smith had written, I don't know, 30 some years ago, about Bill Paley, and a biography about Bill Paley and the founding of CBS. It is called In All His Glory. And by the time I got to the end of the book, I was really more fascinated by Truman and Babe Paley than I was by Bill, even though he was interesting in his own right. And so I had always loved Capote. I'd read his works growing up, and then I just kind of did a deep dive into wanting to learn more about him than I'd known, rereading the works, and then I thought there seemed to me, even though there had been two feature films, the infamous and Capote, about Truman, both focused heavily on the writing of In Cold Blood. And as I did more research, I found there was more to the man, certainly, than just that moment in his life. And so I dug in, and then thought there was a documentary there, and we were in the process of doing a documentary, and a family friend said, and of course I had in my reading I had read George Plimpton's amazing book and oral history that he'd spent about a decade working on about Truman, and so I read that, and a friend said, "Oh, have you should speak to George's widow, Sarah." And Sarah and I had numerous conversations, and she said, "I think I have George's audio tapes somewhere. I don't know if it'd be helpful." And I said, "You could find them," and it was just a gold mine of wonderful history.
And what did you find out in the process of going through these materials and researching Truman's life? What did you learn about him that you thought hadn't actually been sort of covered? Like, what about this man do you think people weren't necessarily familiar enough with?
Yeah, I think Truman has this reputation certainly of being brilliant, but he also has a reputation for being a bit biting, and kind of a witty turn of a phrase, rapier wit sort of thing, and frankly being kind of mean. And the biggest surprise for me was finding out about, and then meeting and spending and developing a relationship with Kate Harrington, who was the daughter of one of Truman's last lovers, who basically Truman adopted when she was 13, and Kate moved in with him, and she considers him her father. And that was extraordinary because for me, it opened up another side of him. I think my production team and I, when we came into this, I felt very, not ambivalent, but maybe that is the right word, ambivalent about Truman. I didn't love him or hate him. I thought he was a genius, and I knew he was flawed. But so much of my production team, there was vitriol. How could he do that to his friends? How could he write answered prayers? He's such a mean guy. And there was something about finding Kate, meeting her, spending a lot of time with her. She is beyond even what comes through, I think, in the film. She's incredibly intelligent and warm and loving and so cultured. And so, and because she attributes so much of that to Truman, it's hard, I believe, when someone creates a family, no matter how they create that family, and they pour that love and the goodness of themselves into someone else, it's really difficult not to appreciate that there's a different side to who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the film sort of offers many different takes on who Truman was and why he did some of the things that he did. But do you have sort of your own opinion that you formed of, like, I guess specifically why he did make that decision to more or less turn on his friends sort of later in his life with answered prayers?
It's interesting because answered prayers is something that Truman had been working on for an incredibly long time. I mean, when you really he had first started talking to people about the fact that he was working on it back in the late 50s, and people knew he was working on it. And so I think part of it is that everything Truman wrote was really about what he saw. You know what I mean? I mean, Breakfast at Tiffany's was a composite of a number of different women. I mean, the movie made it this terribly chic and sexy thing that everyone wanted to be Audrey Hepburn. But the reality of the situation was, when you read it, it's it's a pretty ruthless story. She's a call girl. It's not, and you think to yourself, gosh, who was dreaming of saying that's me? And I think what Truman hoped and what he thought Answered Prayers would be, as he often called it or thought of it as his Proustian novel, he thought that it would be something similar. He would shine a light on people and an element of society, and he would really illuminate it for everyone else, this very elite group of people. And I think his hope and his belief was that the writing would be so strong that it would speak for itself. And I think by the time Answered Prayers was ready, and the work, certainly the latter years that he was working on it, I think Truman's work got a bit sloppy. And I think alcohol and drug addiction, made it was just not as strong as the majority of his work. So I always ask the question, if the work had been as strong as Breakfast at Tiffany's or as strong as In Cold Blood, would people have had the same reaction to it? Who can say? But they did know that they were being written about.
Well, yeah, maybe they would have been honored if the writing had been really
If the
strong
writing had been
to have been
exactly,
torn apart
exactly. And it's
beautifully.
still, by the way, it's still to me, it's not poor writing. It's just not up to Truman's
Yeah,
standard.
that's a high bar to meet for sure.
Yeah.
Well, did you encounter in the process of, seeking out people who knew Truman or their family members, that there are any sort of like still hurt feelings or any sort of soreness about him and what he said about people?
I think I think today we're in a moment where so many of those people are no longer with us. But I would say, yes, people carried that resentment. Um, they didn't let it go. And I think it's interesting because for a lot of people, it was the first, um, for a lot of people, it was the first time that private lives had really been revealed as public lives. And so it was the ultimate, today we're so used to it. Today, everything, it's an Instagram, it's a tweet, we've had Vanity Fair, and so, we've had a different bar. But I think a lot of people held on to it, and certainly Marella and Yelly, certainly Babe Paley took it to her grave. So there was a lot of hurt that was associated with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable. But that's so true. And I think one of the experts that you talked to mentions that he's sort of originated reality TV, or at least the sort of impulses that we see in reality TV of kind of oversharing, of, delighting in this sort of tawdry aspects of people's personal lives, which is something that people sort of seek out now, which is, it is funny that that was looked down upon so much back then. Um, but one thing that I found particularly moving about the film, and that, I mean, obviously, I think people know that Truman Capote was gay, and that was not a secret, but was the way that the film does sort of delve into the way that he carried his sexuality with him throughout his life. And I guess I wondered if you could just sort of speak to that aspect of the film, because I feel like it does touch upon it in really moving ways.
It was one of the things that was really important to me to try piece of the story to try and tell. Because you asked me earlier about one of the things that I realized about Truman making the film. One was that I had always thought of him as a writer. I knew he was gay, certainly, but I never, as a gay man myself, I never thought of him as a pioneer. I never thought of him as kind of you know, a gay man at the forefront. And part of that is he just kind of lived his life as who he was. He wasn't a person who was particularly prone to taking up any kind of causes. But that said, he lived a very open life, and he did it in a time when that was not okay. And what I found, and when I talk about Kate Harrington and that kind of adoption, what I find so compelling and so moving is that in a time when you couldn't create a family, he was so determined to create one, and he did it, and she's extraordinary. And so I think it's one of those. I hope that the audience takes away, you know, I have four children, and I take for granted the amazing ability in the world that I live in that allows me to create the family that my husband and I have and want to have. But he was a pioneer in the sense that he did something that um, was not only not the norm, but was actively that laws and people were hostile towards. And I think that is something about him that is really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, it's super. I think it adds this new way of sort of looking at him because, I mean, something that comes up from multiple people is that he was sort of an exhausting person to be around. And Norman Mailer, in that really amazing interview, describes how exhausting he thinks it must be to be Truman Capote, which really just
Yeah.
meant to be so openly gay um, at that time in a straight bar, which coming from Norman Mailer especially was just such an amazing sentiment.
Such an amazing sentiment, right? I mean, and I think Norman, I think on the tapes, one of the amazing gifts from George in these tapes was you really hear the admiration that Norman had for Truman, not just in the way that he lived, but also when he talks about the fact that no one wrote better sentences. It's a rare moment of real praise from him.
Yeah. I mean, did you feel some responsibility in the film too? Because I think Truman Capote's personal life does, in some ways, in the public eye, kind of overtake his writing for some people. And that the films that you mentioned earlier, I think they, like, especially Capote, makes it almost look like In Cold Blood was just a purely personal project for him and not this amazing piece of artistry, which it was. But did you feel some responsibility to sort of shift attention back to his talent?
I did. Look, when I first started this film, I think my youngest son was 14, maybe 15. And all I kept saying was I wanted something where he would be able to watch the film and walk away interested in something, whether it was picking up In Cold Blood or whether it was, I wanted something. He didn't have to like the whole thing. It's a 15-year-old boy. It's like maybe he would, maybe he would. I want him to walk away with something. And the literature was something that I felt like I wanted to put front and center, and I wanted to read passages and display the work, put the work, because the work is what mattered to Truman. And I also think the work for Truman has gotten lost. And part of that is because Truman was such a personality, and he was on Johnny Carson, and he was on late night shows, and he was, the black and white ball, and he was a social arbiter. But I think there was and as such, I think not just the literary establishment, but he was denied. Truman, I think if I remember correctly, Truman won 2 Henry Prizes for short stories, but he never won the Pulitzer. Some of the big literary prizes, the big things that he should have gotten, he never got. And so and I think a lot of that was because that literary establishment, the powers that be at the time, said a writer should not also be a personality. You should be, in a box writing. And so for me, I wanted to put the writing front and center because I think it's important to try and remind people that it's all just exceptional work.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to go back and reread everything now, having
That's
watched
the
it.
goal.
So,
That's
yeah,
the
and
goal.
hopefully people who haven't had a chance to read his work will do that too. Um, but going back to some of the personal stuff, in going through the tapes, was there anything that was particularly surprising to you, or even just any sort of like anecdotes that jump out, maybe even things that didn't make it into the film?
You know, there's so much in those tapes because it's also, they were done over a period of time, and there's some funny little things like, you hear George, with Lauren Bacall, and they're trying to get the tape recorder to work, and he's like, "Is it on?" And she's like, "Is it on?" And then you hear her be like, "Oh, just make me another drink," and you hear like, ice clinking and drinks pouring. So the tapes, in some ways, were great because they were evocative of the era. They gave a little bit of that throwback to those people from that era who were just such, I mean, great characters in and of themselves. I think there's so much, unfortunately, that didn't make it into the film, but I'm trying to think of a particular Truman story. I mean, I think the major ones did make it in, but I think the one thing that the tapes really showed about him was that the universal thing was that everyone found him fascinating. Everyone, he was your dream dinner partner at a dinner party. Like everyone knew that they would walk away intrigued and excited and having learned something new. But there was also one story on there, and the person's still alive, so it'll remain nameless because they didn't want to be included. But she said, I told Truman a secret, and halfway through telling him the secret, he said to me, "Please stop. Please stop. Don't tell me anymore." And she said, he loved me enough to know that he couldn't keep the secret. So his way of showing his love for me was to not want to know the story.
Wow.
And I thought that was a really interesting look also at the character of the man.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, well, I hope the transcripts are published someday because I'm sure there's tons of juicy stuff in
Good
there.
stuff. That's good
um,
stuff.
well, Ebes, before we let you go, this film has been on the festival circuit now for a while, which obviously had a little bit of a dip, I'm sure, just because of COVID and
Yeah.
everything. But I was just wondering sort of what you've been up to, what the future of the film will be, and what your future is looking like, what projects you're working on too.
Well, the film will come out in some form of theaters, or the film will be released in some form, um, either late 2020, either December, or early January, February 2021. So obviously COVID has us kind of refiguring out all of those movements, but it'll be out sometime around then. And so I'm super excited and hope people really flock to it. And also, I hope people really just go and read Truman. And as for me, I'm working on a few other projects right now that aren't quite ready to be talked about, but I think there's a couple of feature projects and another documentary. So hopefully more to come in the near future.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time to
Thank you,
talk to
Travis.
us today, and we're really, really thrilled to be able to share the Capote tapes with our audience. So, thank you, everyone at home, and thank you, Eve.
Thank you, guys.